It's honestly surprising to see Thoma capitalize so well on his biggest strength, and not only can he keep your characters protected, but there's also a few teams he excels at. The only thing that really matters when looking at Thoma's playstyle is how the shield works. There's the big shield you can get from his elemental skill, and then the smaller ones that get generated from his burst attacks. All of them stack together, so you can grow the shield into a chunky beast that absorbs most of the attacks, and what's also cool about it is that he gets a passive which helps increase the shield strength by up to 25% whenever a new shield gets created, and you can easily do this without any enemies present with any character. You can see for yourself after doing 5 attacks when fighting invisible ghosts, and the maximum shield strength is achieved. So it's pretty easy when it comes to Thoma's shield management. You set it and forget it, then carry on with the next character. You probably want to do his elemental skill first, then the burst, so that the bigger shield gets generated and keeps you safe from incoming attacks, since you don't actually gain a shield with the initial burst explosion, and you have to attack at least once to start generating them. Otherwise, just keep in mind there is a limit to how big the shield can get, but because of its unique nature of stacking and refreshing itself constantly with Thoma's burst attacks, you should effectively maintain it without reaching the limit. That is, of course, if you can get hit at least once in a while. When you start thinking about Thoma's build, it's basically like a puzzle you need to solve, and the key to it is going to be his efficient energy management due to his high burst cost. It's also worth noting that his damage performance isn't something you can write home about, since it's clear miHoYo is focusing on releasing characters that are great at one or two things, instead of being good at everything like our Benny Boy or Xingqiu, but it's not that big of a deal, and in reality, just helps us focus on the best aspects someone like Thoma can offer. And there's basically two ways how you can build him, one of which is a more balanced take on his entire kit, so you can go for the usual artifacts and stats, while the other playstyle is just basically molding him into a shield bot, which means stacking up a lot of health from artifacts and weapons. Just keep in mind, no matter how you choose to play him, it's important to keep his energy recharge somewhere around 180%, and that's if you don't have his 4th constellation unlocked, which we'll get into more about this later in the video. So with that in mind, two weapons that pretty much define him are going to be either the Catch or Favonius Lance, and if you still haven't fully refined this godly fishing weapon, now would be the best time thanks to Thoma's passive, but obviously, the Catch isn't just great on him, since a lot of you are probably using this weapon on Xiangling or Raiden, and if you don't want them to compete for it, Favonius Lance remains a solid choice, especially those extra particles you get to generate. Now for a budget option, or if you want to maximize his shield, Black Tassel is pretty good, and on the other end of the spectrum sits Staff of, well, Thoma you could even call it, but it's probably a weapon that you'll want to use on Hu Tao if you have her, or even other offensive polearm users, although if you do decide to use it on him, it will boost his offensive and defensive capabilities by a good amount. Just keep in mind that if all you're missing is some energy, you can always craft a single copy of Prototype Star Glitter and just take advantage of its substat, but it is the weakest option out of all the energy weapons. Now for Thoma's artifacts, it couldn't get more simple. It's strongly recommended you try and get the full emblem set because it will increase his burst's damage and provide him with the much needed energy, while the main stats should be health on Sands, pyro damage on Goblet, and critical rate on Circlet. Although if you decide to skip the weapon with energy substat, you can just swap in the Sands with energy recharge instead. And as for building thick shields, a mix of tenacity and emblem 2 set bonuses, coupled with health on every main stat is something you can do, but just remember this is a hyper-focused build that isn't well-rounded in all aspects, and also if you decide to use Black Tassel, then you'll want to use energy recharge Sands. But those are basically his builds. You can see the comparison between the two here, and for the endgame player, it's more than likely you'll want to stick with the first one, but for those who want a more healthy approach to Thoma's kit, well, it can be done. No matter how you build Thoma, it really comes down to how well you understand his placement in team comps. Now, there are a couple of details you need to be aware of before setting off with your team, and the biggest one has to be the internal cooldown, also known as ICD, when you're using his burst. If you're still not aware of it, ICD is basically how often characters' abilities will cause elemental reactions, and a good example would be Xiangling's Pyronado, which has no ICD and will always cause a reaction, while in Thoma's case, it will happen every 3 or so burst attacks, with the small exception being the initial explosion he causes that ignores ICD. To put it simply, his capability to cause reactions is mediocre to say the least, but his burst will apply a lot of pyro, so you can think of him like a wingman who helps out other teams to set up their reactions instead. It's also worth noting his burst attacks won't reach enemies when they're sucked up into Venti's vortex, and you cannot snapshot it with attack boosting abilities. But on the bright side, some of these limitations actually work in his favor when it comes comes to building teams, and there's no better example than Hu Tao. In the past, it was either Amber, Yanfei, or Bennett that would act as Pyro Applicator for the prankster, but it wasn't that great considering the overall synergy, and now that Thoma is out, he has definitely become a great addition to this powerful team comp. Not only his shield is the perfect answer to letting Hu Tao live on the edge and maximize on her playstyle, but he applies so much pyro that it's easy to swirl it with Viridescent Anemo User, and then wrap it all together into a nice performance. And let's not forget the Pyro Resonance and Pyro Particles you gain with him. Obviously, you'll want Xingqiu for this team to work, and one important thing to keep in mind would be that from time to time, Thoma will steal Hu Tao's Vaporized reactions, which basically means he consumes the Hydro Aura on enemies with his burst, but this will become less of a problem if you have a C6 Xingqiu, thanks to how his Hydro Swords will apply even more Hydro and keep this from happening too often. Just understand that if everyone is at 0 constellations, a team like this is still very powerful. Now, if you play in the Abyss, there's always that competition between two teams trying to share your strongest characters, and recently, Raiden's National Variation has been seeing a lot of action from the Abyss usage statistics. However, Benny is wanted by basically everyone, so you can replace him with Thoma and it actually works pretty well. Not as great as with Bennett, but it definitely gets the job done nicely, and since Raiden's damage benefits from Thoma's 80 burst cost, you can also be more forgiving towards his energy recharge build, thanks to Raiden's insane energy generation. There's also Mono Pyro with Kazuha that you can go for, but just like every other Mono team, your results will vary, especially when you've got Abyss 12-1 with Pyro Resistance enemies, although his non-intrusive playstyle combines really well with the rest of the team. Now, it's probably a good time to talk about his constellations, because while they do offer significant upgrades, it's not like you cannot use him properly at C0, so most of them are focused on helping him do more for less. Like, for example, the first constellation, as mouthful as it is, simply states that any character besides Thoma who get damaged when they have his shield will effectively decrease both his elemental skill and burst cooldowns by 3 seconds. It's a pretty decent upgrade that helps out with refreshing his shield constantly. The next constellation gives additional 3 seconds to his burst duration, and the most notable thing you'll notice is that the burst duration will be around 18 seconds, and thanks to the first upgrade, it will overlap with the 17-second cooldown, which means with proper energy management and getting hit at least once, you can always expect to use his burst off cooldown. But probably the biggest upgrade has to be the fourth constellation, because it will essentially decrease his burst cost from 80 to 65, so you can literally just use an energy substat weapon and emblem set to keep his burst up consistently. In fact, this kind of indirectly buffs his damage and shield, since you can now have more leeway with substats like health. Finally, the last constellation actually rewards the team for generating Thoma's shield in the form of increased normal, charged, and plunge attack damage by 15%, which is pretty great, but it's definitely not a dramatic upgrade compared to other C6 characters like Xingqiu or Kujo-Sara. So, in short, C0 Thoma is absolutely fine, but if you're really dead set on obtaining some of those constellations, the first one is actually a good stopping point, although C4 is still probably his best one, just because of how much easier it makes it to build his energy management. Thoma's Housekeeper title is a fitting one because he keeps your team clean from those nasty enemy damage numbers, while at the same time, you barely get to see him in action, just like any other Housekeeper. The biggest takeaways about him would be that his shield mechanic is really easy to use, just set it and forget it while focusing on the rest of your team's rotation. It's also great to see him working just fine at 0 constellations without needing to rely on any of them, where the same cannot be said about someone like Kujo-Sara. You get what you wish for, and any additional constellations just provide him with high quality of life improvements to his overall performance. Now, on the other hand, few notable setbacks about him has to be the high burst cost, which means sacrificing offensive stats for energy recharge. Not to mention, MiHoYo did get a little stingy with his damage multipliers. There's also the fact his base maximum health is barely higher than Diona's, and almost 50% less when compared to other 5-stars like Zhongli and Hu Tao, so if it already wasn't enough, you need to work on building that shield. Its overall absorption gets a slight setback from his maximum health, but overall, he is a clearly defined character that works extremely well with Hu Tao, and quite nicely with few other teams. So if you like the idea of defensiveness and utility as part of your team's features, well, you did get to the end of the video. One final note about Thoma would be that the general mentality towards every new character release has been either they need to be universally awesome or compete with other 4-stars like Bennett, but let's be real, MiHoYo hasn't been doing this for a while now. Thoma is honestly a refreshing take on a character that knows how to capitalize on his niche role, and because right now he is featured alongside Hu Tao's banner, there's a huge chance you end up with him if you're trying to obtain Hu Tao, and you can then build a fun and viable team for yourself. And as always, just give some time, and we might even discover something more awesome about him. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.